on. So over to you, Will, to begin the session. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thanks very much, Kate, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much again for joining us, especially on your lunch break. Really great to see so many of you here for what I think is going to be a really fantastic discussion around queer mental health in early careers. I'm really excited about this event. We've got a fantastic panel lined up, so I think you're all very lucky, and I'm definitely looking forward to learning a lot from it. So to introduce myself, my name is Will Banks. I'm a policy analyst at the Bank of England, but more importantly for today, a member of the City Mental Health Alliance's Thriving from the Start Committee, which is a group of young people in their early careers across the financial, professional services and legal industries, all of us passionate about breaking down stigma surrounding mental health. I'll be chairing today's discussion and kind of bringing my perspective as a gay man and a member of the queer community. But what I'm much more excited about is the fantastic group of panelists that we have lined up. So we've got a few themes that we're going to discuss today. So 3 themes and a kind of guided Q&A with the panelists. But I'd note that we also have the option at the end to ask anonymous questions using the Q&A box, which you can see at the bottom of your screens. So please do give us questions and we'll answer as many as we have time to at the end. I should note that the event is being recorded and may be shared with CMH members after the fact, so please just do be aware of that. And without any further ado, I'm really excited to introduce you to our fantastic panel, and I'll hand over to each of them to introduce themselves, starting with Oscar.
Hello, everybody. My name's Oscar Hoyle. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a non-binary person that's actively involved in trans and non-binary change making. I'm the founder of Blossom LGBT CIC, which is a not-for-profit focusing on creating sober social spaces and upskilling spaces for LGBTQ+ young adults aged 18 to 25 in Surrey. And I'm also a director at Trans in the City, where I'm currently focusing on building a professional development and mentoring scheme for young trans and non-binary people.
That's fab. Thank you, Oscar. And we'll move on to Steph next.
Thanks, Will. Hi, I'm Steph Gallagher. My pronouns are she, her, and I identify as queer. I joined the Bank of England last May as the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Lead for the Financial Stability area. And prior to that, I worked in HR partnering at Lloyds Banking Group. And so currently I work with Will, and he's invited me here today to join the panel.
Great, thanks, Steph, and thank you for being here. Nicole.
Thanks, Will. So hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Fernandez, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm currently a senior associate in assurance at PwC. I'm also a member of the Thriving from the Start committee with Will and Farima, who you'll see in a bit. I'm also a bisexual woman, and I'm a part of the Shine committee at PwC, which is our LGBTQ+ network here. I'm really passionate about, talking about mental health in the workplace and bringing transparency to that area. So I'm really excited to be here.
Great, thanks, Nicole. And we're really excited that you're here. And then finally, hand over to Farima.
Thanks, Will. I'm really excited to be here as well. My name is Farima Darbyshire. My pronouns are she, her. I'm Director of Programmes at the City Mental Health Alliance and I have the privilege of working with the Thriving from the Start Network Committee on the work they do. And one of the programmes that I look at the CMHA is just how we can best support the mental health of young people as they make that transition from education into the workplace and into the first few years of their career. And I'm really excited about this conversation today. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Farima. So if there's one takeaway from those introductions is that we're all very excited to be here. So that's good news. I should have said at the start that I use he, him pronouns as well, just to be aware. So before we get stuck into the discussion, I wanted to give a bit of background as to why we thought that an event like this would be important, especially given that many of you might not have attended an event specifically on queer mental health in early careers before. And I guess there are kind of 2 angles through which we're looking at mental health in today's discussion. And the first is around early careers mental health. And we know from the extensive work that CMHA and others do that many people in their early careers do experience poor mental health. So the City Mental Health Alliance's Time to Act survey showed that nearly 3/4 of people in their early careers had experienced poor mental health at some point in the year leading up to the survey. And even more shockingly, 1 in 6 or 17% have experienced suicidal thoughts in that period. And those statistics are very alarming. There is clearly kind of a very large issue with early careers mental health. And we know that the workplace is a substantial contributor, both in positive and in negative ways, to people's mental health. So around 3/4 of young people say that their sense of purpose and community from work positively impacts their mental health, but obviously work can also have a less positive impact. Nearly half of survey respondents said that feeling as if they don't fit in the workplace has negatively impacted their well-being, and a similar proportion say that trying to conceal their poor mental health from their employer has further negatively impacted their mental health. So it's very clear that there is kind of a very important issue to be discussed around mental health in early careers. The second strand of this panel is to do with the queer community, and that's another place that we know there are particularly acute mental health issues. So research by Mind shows that queer people are 2 to 3 times more likely to report having a mental health problem than heterosexual cisgender people. And research from Stonewall shows that 7 in 10 trans people have experienced anxiety within the past year. The incidence of mental ill health is also higher among queer people of colour, disabled people, and those who have experienced hate crimes. So again, it's very clear that mental health is a very kind of important topic to be discussing within the queer community. What we know a little bit less about at the moment is the intersection between those two things, and that is where I think this panel event will provide a really interesting and useful discussion. So in this event, we're hoping to shed some light on exactly that intersection. We wanted to create a space where queer people can discuss early career mental health and the unique challenges that they might face in the workplace compared to others in their early careers. We'll also talk a little bit at the end, and Farama will come in about what employers can do to support their queer talent as well, which we think is an important part of the conversation. Now, just before we move on to hearing from our excellent panelists, I wanted to make a quick note on language. So you'll note that so far I have used the term queer rather than the term LGBTQ+. And I'd note, first of all, that we're using those two terms interchangeably, so please do feel free in your questioning to use whichever term is comfortable with you. We're aware that the term queer does have some sensitivities, and we kind of understand that, but upon consulting with the panel and kind of other young people, we agreed that this is the term that most of the panel identify with. But please do feel free to use the term LGBTQ+ if you would like to, and we'll come on to talk a little bit about language later on in the session as well, so there should be some interesting discussion there. And hopefully that set the scene nicely for then to move on to the set of questions we've got for our incredible panelists. So as I said, we've organised the event into 3 themes. Firstly, to talk about coming out and belonging, then to talk about language and behaviour, as I just mentioned, and finally to talk about the networks and support that queer people can draw upon in their early careers. So I'll start with a question about coming out and belonging. So I think it's very interesting when starting your career that you do at some point have to come out, and that is something that those outside the queer community don't necessarily have to face or experience. And a question to our panelists, and maybe Oscar will start with you, is how does being and coming out as queer impact mental health in early careers, in your experience, both as a mentor and your own experience? And then also we're interested in how that might differ for people of different identities, such as transgender and bisexual people. Oscar, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we as individuals, we build our expectations on coming out from a number of different factors. So things like what we read externally, the general culture in an organization, but I guess most importantly to this topic is how people react to us and our identities when we do come out to them. And at the early stages of our career, we don't have that understanding of how people may react in a professional setting. So one of the key things around coming out at sort of an early stage of your career is this is setting the expectations for whether you're going to feel open within the job that you're in, but also how it will impact on you coming out in future careers as well. And negative reactions to sort of within the early stages of our career will create an unwillingness to come out, which can turn into sort of impacting on our mental health. And that's because not being truthful to who you are takes a huge amount of mental energy. I always give the example, try and talk about your weekend without naming any sort of names, places. It's incredibly difficult to do. And if you imagine doing that when you're trying to talk about yourself or maybe what you were up to at the weekend, if, for example, you went out to a gay bar, that's really difficult to do if you're not out in the workplace. So that mental energy is a huge impact. It can also sort of impact on or how you feel you fit in with an organization and its culture too. Funnily enough, Will, I'm also quoting Stonewall here. A Stonewall 2018 survey found that 2 in 5 bi people aren't out to anybody at work about their identity. And similarly, 1 in 4 trans people aren't open at work as well. So when you think about it, that's quite a large proportion of the community that aren't out to people at work. And that in itself shows why it's so important that we create these positive cultures within the workplace. And of course, it's different for everybody. So we're talking about different identities. For a trans or non-binary person, not being out is going to impact on every single part of your career and your sort of wider life. You know, you're not having the correct name used for you in the workplace. You're not having the correct pronouns used in the workplace. Even something as small as the email address that people send to doesn't match to who you are. And that can feel incredibly erasing. And for bi people as well, you know, not being able to talk about dates that they went on, or maybe only being able to talk about half of the dates that they went on, can also be incredibly difficult in the workplace. I mean, for me, my first job was in a builder's merchant, which no one can believe when I say that. But the anxiety of going to a branch, not being open about who I am and having to sort of hear banter from builders, but not wanting to sort of call out that behavior because I wasn't open about who I was, took a massive toll on me and definitely impacted on my confidence in the workplace as well. Whereas now I work in an organization where I'm openly queer, and it means that I dress in the way that feels most appropriate to me. It gives me more confidence to stand up. And actually what that does is it creates a sense of belonging in my workplace for me, but also a sense of pride in the work that I do because I'm authentic and true to who I am. Hopefully that answered the question.
It definitely did. That's a really fantastic answer, Oscar. Thank you. And I can definitely relate to your point around kind of the mental energy required to obscure your identity being a real drag on mental health. And nods from the panel suggest it's not just you that's experienced that. Is there anyone else that would like to come in on this topic? Maybe Nicole or Stephanie. Nicole, over to you.
Yeah, sure. Just to kind of follow up on Oscar's points, you know, I myself wasn't out at work for a long time just because of you know, that fear of I don't know what the reaction is going to be. And going to places where you feel you can open up. I think that's a really key point here, because for me, when I found the Shine network at PwC, it really allowed me to feel more like myself at work. You know, and the work that we do as part of the network really allows me to then focus on things that I'm passionate about in areas that are helpful to me and others, you know. So I feel like once I found the network, I was then, you know, I felt part of the company. I felt more a place that I belonged a bit more, you know. I felt more able to then talk about myself more openly. And, you know, I didn't find this network till a few years into my career. So, you know, when I look back to the beginning of my career, it definitely would have been really helpful for me to be able to be more open in the workplace had I found the network earlier.
Definitely, thanks, Nicole. And it really does take time, doesn't it, to build up that comfort and that feeling of support to then feel comfortable being authentic. But as Oscar mentioned, you know, once you are able to do that, it's easy to take a bit more pride in your work, I think. Steph, did you want to come in on this?
Honestly, I think I'd be echoing exactly what Nicole just said. So I've had the same experience with networks and kind of specific places within a work environment where you can kind of be yourself, and the confidence that builds over a couple of years, I think, is really not to be underestimated. So yeah, just the same kind of point, I think.
Great, thanks, Steph. And one thing we've touched on just there is the potential reaction of colleagues being in a worry that's in a lot of our minds kind of before deciding to come out and deciding when to come out and who to. And that kind of touches on a related part of the career experience, which I think can be microaggressions from colleagues. So I'd be interested to hear, and Nicole, we'll start with you. Kind of, is that something that you've experienced now that you are out in your workplace? And if so, how has that impacted your sense of belonging at work?
Yeah, sure. You know, the thing for me is because I mentioned I wasn't out for a long time, I was less open to talking about who I am, what my sexuality is, because I just felt that most of the people that were surrounding me at work, you know, in my teams, were more heteronormative. So I used to get to know people much better before I felt like I could open up. So I was definitely guarded. You know, I didn't really face microaggressions once I did open up, because to be fair, I had to like trust someone before I could open up. So it was at that point where I knew I wasn't going to get, a bad reaction, that I felt like I could open up. So I didn't feel those at that point, so my sense of belonging, but it was fractured because I felt guarded, because I had to keep that guard up, and see who I could trust before I could open up. But after finding Shine, I'm much more open with myself. Now I'm definitely fully open with myself. I've even changed my company picture to have the LGBTQ plus flag as the border. And, I have in my contact card at work, I have added details of the Shine network. So, anyone who clicks on my profile or hovers over my name, they'll know exactly who I am and what I'm a part of. And to be honest, since then, I haven't faced any microaggressions, which is honestly a really positive experience and really reassuring, I think. And I think that's something that we can take away, right? So it's like we have this fear that we might get bad reactions, but 9 out of 10 times, it's not going to be the case. So just having that trust, I think.
Definitely, thanks, Nicole. Hopefully that's really reassuring, especially if there's anyone on the call who currently isn't out in the workplace. I definitely echo your thought that once you do it, it's kind of never as bad as you can build it up in your head to be. And I really like the idea of finding some way to signal you're part of the community, whether that's like a flag or part of your email footer. A lovely idea. Did anyone else want to come in on this? Yeah, Oscar.
I think when we talk about microaggressions, it's so broad as to what they could look like. And I know certainly for me, there are times where I feel a bit hoodwinked, where I have a conversation and then I reflect on it. I'm like, oh, actually, I'm not sure if that was as kind as I thought it was in the moment. But something that I see so often, particularly with gender non-conforming people, trans people, or even cis people who present in a way that doesn't necessarily align with what societal norms of that gender is that there's a consistent use of just they, them to describe everybody, which for a long time organizations advocated for as sort of a way to communicate with people when you don't know their pronouns. But actually what it does is it completely denies that person's identity if they don't actually use those pronouns. So if you look at referring to, say, a woman with they them pronouns, then you're still misgendering somebody. It's just as uninclusive as if you were to use the complete wrong pronouns. And I think that's a microaggression that actually we should talk more about in workplaces, is just being confident enough to say to someone, what are your pronouns, instead of necessarily just assuming they them for everybody.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And kind of normalizing having, for example, pronouns in email footers, right, can be one way of kind of normalizing that conversation. Thank you. Steph, did you want to come in on this topic?
I suppose, yeah, I was just thoughtful on microaggressions in particular. I think there can sometimes be a line between kind of healthy conversation and a level of curiosity, and actually when you start to get to the point of actually that's quite a lot of very personal questions that you're now being asked, and is that necessarily normal or something that you might expect in a professional setting? So I think for me, I'll talk about it more in a minute, but I've used several terms over the years to kind of describe my identity. And when I was using pansexual, I would get a lot of, okay, so how is that different to bisexual? So how do you know that though? Could you explain that a bit further? And I think sometimes it's coming from a place of genuine curiosity, and there's an appropriate space around you to discuss that. And sometimes it's actually, I'm under deadline, I'm trying to get my work done, and this is feeling a little bit personal. And I think context can be really important to when a question kind of steers into being a microaggression as opposed to a question.
Yeah, that's really useful. Thanks, Steph. And there definitely is that line, isn't there, between asking for more information versus kind of asking you kind of a fairly intrusive question when actually you're at your job to do your work, right? Yeah, I'm sorry that you've experienced that. I think this kind of tees us up quite nicely to move on to the next topic we had lined up, which is around language and behaviour. So we mentioned at the top, kind of, there are questions around the use of the word queer versus LGBTQ+. Oscar has mentioned kind of difficulties around using the correct pronouns and how that can be received by people when they are mispronounced. And similarly, as Steph just mentioned, kind of questions around which label you use for your sexuality as well. So often queer people feel that they aren't able to bring their whole selves to work, and I think language can be a really important part of that, as we've just seen. And Steph, maybe I'll come back to you to just kind of ask a bit about how you find expressing your sexual identity in the workplace and kind of how you express it. What does that mean for your sense of belonging within work?
Yeah, thank you. So if I talk a bit about my first job, I think I joined a bank on a graduate scheme. I'd grown up in Wolverhampton, and then I was offered this placement in London, and I was a 22-year-old woman who identified at the time as bisexual, working in a bank with no prior experience. And I did have a degree, but it was in ancient history, so it wasn't terribly relevant. And I felt like there were quite a few sort of subtle differences, I suppose, between me and the people that I was surrounded by, and most of them were kind of things that I could hide, and that included my sexual identity. And I think there's this element of sort of self-policing, and at the time I would have said, I think I would have been quite defensive and said, no, you know, I just choose not to talk about certain things at work because they're not relevant. And I think actually since then I've learned that they are relevant, a bit like Oscar was saying earlier. These the way that we choose to identify it becomes a part of your being. And so when I reflect back on my early career, I might have found myself looking for common ground to make small talk, to try and be memorable or make a good impression. And so again, like Oscar said, I might not mention if I'd spent the weekend planning my Pride outfit. And then when I got closer to my team, I noticed there were some conversational sort of assumptions that I was straight. So if I had a date, the response might be, what's his name, or where did you meet him? And I wouldn't necessarily correct it. And then after a while, I really got to know these people, and they were really lovely, and the culture was lovely at the company. But I'd gone on for quite a while not mentioning being bisexual, and I was internally thinking, actually, am I pansexual? And I'd previously struggled with anxiety, and I think I was really overthinking the whole thing, and the behavioural policing, the masking, just sort of perpetuated itself. And then I ended up in a long-term relationship with a straight cis man as well. So I was having a lot of internal reflection on, oh, it would feel really unnatural and irrelevant now for me to bring up this core part of my identity. Where's the space to do that? So I had quite a lot of discomfort, but it was all really quite internal. It wasn't to do with my team or to do with the people around me. And eventually I just sort of said to my team, hey, I'm bisexual. And they were really, really supportive and celebratory more than anything. So it ended up being a really nice experience in the end. But I think that was an environment where I probably could have talked openly about the self-reflection that I was going through. And so all those different terms, I think your point was about language. Your question was focused on language. And there was a lot of confusion in my head about what would be the most appropriate term for me to describe my own identity, and can I talk about that at work, and is it still relevant now that I'm in a relationship, and all of this kind of mulling over I could have done outwardly, because I did have the support, I did have this really kind of safe environment, but I put so much pressure on myself and somehow internalized the fact that actually this isn't something that you can do at work. And so I suppose when we say bring your whole self to work, we're probably not being completely literal, but at the same time, I think we are talking about things that are core to your own being. And I now see identity as one of those things. So for me, kind of being able to talk about the language and be open in the language that we use at work are both really important.
Thanks, Steph. That's really interesting. I'm impressed that you can plan your Pride outfit in a weekend. It takes me a lot longer than that, I must say. I think your point around kind of a lot of this being internal is interesting, because there is a difference, right, between a neutral environment and a proactively inclusive environment. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that. Of it kind of shouldn't be, the onus shouldn't be on young queer people to proactively come out. We need to feel that we're in a space that actively includes us, right?
Yeah, it's a super interesting point as well, because the whole concept around coming out, I think, assumes that the default is that you're straight, and so you have to come out as not this default, which when you really look at the language in itself is sort of inherently problematic anyway. But then the reality of the situation for me personally at the time was that I was in an environment where the assumption was that I was straight, and so it necessitates this coming out regardless of what you think kind of should be happening around you. So I think that was one element. So this kind of reflection that I'm having now is all about Lloyd's Bank. So that was where I had my first job, and I must say, like, the environment was actually almost celebratory, rather than just sort of accepting, or you know, it was way beyond, oh yeah, that's fine. It wasn't like that at all. It was actually, that's amazing. Let's talk about that. That's really cool. How would you like to bring that to work? Should we celebrate this in our team? So I think in fairness, the environment was very positive, but that isn't necessarily the case consistently. And as you say, there's probably more to do. I think there definitely is more to do about that very start point. So the assumptions that are baked into the questions that you get asked when you first join work, like I was saying about if I brought up a date, it would be, who's that with? Which man is that with? I think those assumptions, there's probably more to go on that so that we don't necessitate coming out in the first place.
Yeah, that makes sense. That does make sense. Maybe it's the case that a celebratory environment is kind of necessary but not sufficient, right? Like there's still a lot of internal work to do to feel comfortable, but it is
Yeah,
helpful.
that's a lovely way to put it.
Is there anyone else that wanted to come on this topic of language? Oscar, perhaps?
Yeah, so I don't necessarily want to pick up on the topic of language, but more so on some of the comments around sort of policing ourselves. And I think that's something that is so important to a lot of the queer younger people that I work with, is actually how their appearance, their gender expression, right? And it's something that we maybe don't talk enough about when we talk about coming out at work, because to a lot of us, you go to work and you wear a suit, but actually I think that's what's really important, is to aim for authenticity within the remits of the way that you express yourself at work, and you can express yourself at work. There is a dress code to be smart. That's completely fine, but you can still do that in an authentic way. I found myself in my early stages of my career thinking, oh, is this a little bit too camp? Whereas now, you know, I will wear leather trousers to the office and not think twice about it. And I just feel like there is something in that around sort of being able to identify what's appropriate for your workplace, and dressing in a way that is still true to yourself, because actually our appearance is a huge part of how we feel comfortable. And it's fantastic to be open about who you are, but actually that includes your physical expression of who you are as well. And I think that's something that's really important to consider as well when coming out of work, is how you can present yourself in a way that's authentic to who you are.
Definitely, and there's kind of parallels there with what Nicole was saying earlier around kind of putting that you're a member of the LGBT plus network in your email footer, right? It's like finding work appropriate ways of expressing your identity so you feel that you can kind of show up authentically and work as yourself. Nicole, did you want to come in on this topic at all?
I think it's more just to, you know, second what Steph was saying. It's you come into work and I think, Will, you said this as well. It's just there's that neutral, you know, environment, whereas it would be really helpful if it was a proactively inclusive environment, you know, because you are then defaulted in that moment when, for example, Steph was saying, oh, who did you go, which man did you go on a date with? And it's just in that moment, you have to make such a quick decision whether I'm going to correct them or am I just going to go with it? And sometimes your instinct is, oh, I'll just go with it, you know? So it's just creating that environment at work. I think, you know, we take a lot of the responsibility on ourselves, but it should come from the workplace, and to make everyone feel like they can be their authentic selves.
Yeah, I definitely agree. That's a really nice way of putting it, that the onus shouldn't be just on the community, right, to create this inclusive environment. I am keen on, before we move on to the next topic, to kind of touch briefly on the kind of usage of the word queer. Is it something that we've discussed quite a lot in preparation for this event? So as I mentioned at the start, it's a word that I understand all of the panelists feel very comfortable using, but there are some question marks around it. I wonder whether anyone wanted to kind of speak to that particular topic. Steph, you look keen.
Yeah, well, you and I have spoken a lot about this, I think. But yeah, I think it is a really interesting topic, because obviously as language evolves, terms take on new meanings. And I think one of those words is queer. So we know it's been used as a slur for many years, but then I do find that a lot of my friends in their 20s and 30s are increasingly finding the word queer to be the most comfortable label for them. And that's where I've landed as well myself. So in general, I subscribe to the idea that if you find a term upsetting, if anybody finds a term upsetting, it costs you nothing at all to just not use that term. But equally, I also think people have the right to use whatever word is most appropriate to describe their own identity. And so if that word is queer, there's kind of an inherent tension there. I think for me personally, the reason I like the word queer is because it feels a bit less prescriptive. So my identity is probably best described as that I could be romantically interested in anybody who I think has a really cool personality. So gender and appearance and, you know, identity, it doesn't really play a strong role for me in that. And for a while I described that as bisexual and then pansexual. And then, like I said earlier, I found myself having to explain pansexual quite a lot, and it's less commonly used. And I found more and more people were using the term queer to describe this wider range of identities. And I really liked the idea of focusing less on explanations and definitions and a bit more on the sense of community that I felt as being part of that wider group of people that use the term queer. And so for me, that's what it's come to represent. But I think, yeah, that there is an inherent tension, and it's just, it's very personal. So yeah, that's where I've landed on it, but I'd be keen to hear other views.
Definitely, and yeah, I agree that it's definitely something that's kind of down largely to personal preference. And speaking of that, I wondered whether Oscar or Nicole wanted to come in and respond. Nicole, great.
Yeah, I think it's similar to Steph, what Steph was saying. It's just that it was used as a slur, you know, for so many years. But we in the community, you know, especially the younger, you know, generation, they've taken the word back and just said, you know, why should it be a bad word? What do you mean? You know, so it's kind of just giving power to the word and saying, yeah, we're queer and we're here, so what, you know? And I personally also like the use of it. So I interchange between, you know, bisexual and queer, and I go as you say, Steph, because it's non-prescriptive and it just feels natural to say it, because yeah, personally for me as well, I find myself, you know, going out of all these different lines, and sometimes queer is just the best way to describe it. So yeah, I think it's just we've given power to the word to be a positive word and to say it's inclusive, you know?
Definitely. And yeah, I feel a real sense of pride now having a kind of group of young queer people together and being able to use it in a celebratory way. I think it's excellent. Oscar, did you want to come in on this?
I mean, both Nicole and Steph have pretty much summed up what I would say, but I think what I find so interesting about the term is that before it started to be popular, there was this narrative, which is, why does the community need so many labels? Why does it need that? I think that what I really like is that although it probably wasn't reactive, it feels almost a bit like, well, actually, you know, fine, if you don't want us to have so many labels, here we are, we're queer. And then that to be too broad for some people, I find it quite an interesting sort of rabbit hole, which I'll talk about forever if I do, so I won't. But for me, I identify with the term queer, but not necessarily so much around my sexual orientation. That's very fixed. But in terms of my gender identity, that is incredibly, I couldn't even try to label it. So by just using the term queer, it means that I don't need to worry about sort of where I fit exactly on there. When I came out as non-binary, I didn't even really say non-binary. I was like, do you know what? I am just who I am. And I don't really know where that is or what, but I feel more comfortable with these pronouns and I like the term queer. And queer definitely fits me more so than non-binary. So it's a term that I actually hold really closely, and a term that I know through a lot of the connections that I have, I work with a lot of people who would be considered sort of old guard in terms of LGBT change making. For them, it was an interesting journey to be able to start using that term comfortably. But I think people are understanding the power and importance of not shoehorning ourselves, which is why there's been a far more sort of positive uptake of that term than when sort of other terms have tried to be reclaimed in the past.
That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I definitely see a commonality of it being a useful term to kind of avoid definitional panic of like, oh, which of the letters in the acronym am I, right? That feels really powerful. Fantastic. So we'll move on now to the last topic we want to discuss, which kind of zooms out a little bit and thinks about what young queer people can do to feel supported and to feel comfortable in their workplaces, and then looking at the other side of that, what businesses can do to make sure that their young people do feel supported. And Oscar, I'll come to you with the first question on this, which is a kind of broader question of what young queer people can do to build that sense of community and belonging that means they're comfortable being their authentic selves in the workplace.
Yeah, I think I'll get to that, but I think what I really want to sort of flag is why it's so important, right? There was an Open for Business report, quite a few years old now, but what it found is there's significant links between a workplace that's LGBT inclusive and individual performance of colleagues. And then, of course, when you're performing better, you have the better job satisfaction, you're more likely to progress in your career, aspects like that. And that's why the sense of belonging and inclusivity is so important in the workplace. It's totally varied as to how you could do that. For me, where I started work in an environment that was sort of actively discriminative, what was most important for me was actually seeking connections with other sort of queer professionals in similar stages of my career, both inside but more importantly outside of my organization, and building that sort of network around me of people that can provide almost a peer-to-peer support offering, and to understand that people are having similar experiences but also that there was better experiences out there was sort of really empowering to guide me on my future career steps. But I think also something that's really important is that regardless of where you are, whether you're a young person or early in career or later in the career, when you're comfortable, being able to stand up as a role model and sort of as an active change maker and force for good within an organization, things like sharing suggestions on how to create a better working environment with senior leaders, maybe getting involved in a reverse mentoring scheme if there's something like that, that platforms you as somebody who is a safe person. And what not only does that, of course, have fantastic output for the organization, but it also means that you will start to naturally build those connections within the organization of people that are attracted to people who are inclusive and a force for good. And that starts to create that sense of belonging community as well. Like I say, there's loads of different ones, but I'm sure there are other people on the panel that also have suggestions.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you, Oscar. Nicole or Steph, did you want to come in on this? Nicole.
Yeah, and I just want to second Oscar's point as well of, having that network of trusted people outside of work is really helpful too, because you at least feel safe in that way. And another thing is, obviously, I've spoken about Shine, which is our LGBTQ+ network at PwC a lot. So that was a very key point for me, and it was a key turning point for me at work. So finding those support networks at work and people that you can rely on at work to just be yourself, I think that's probably one of the first things that you can do is probably look for those for those safe spaces. And also, I think another thing is being open to sharing and also receiving, be open with yourself, don't be so guarded. And I think another thing is don't be afraid to correct people, because if you want to be authentically yourself, you have to, say it. So don't be afraid to share, and also don't be afraid to correct people.
Definitely. Thanks, Nicole. And Steph, we'll head to you.
Yeah, thank you. So it's kind of a similar point, but I think quite often if your professional environment feels a bit uncomfortable, it's because there's an expectation around you that we should suspend authentic behaviour. And we're all human individuals, and we're going to have good and bad days. And the idea that you have to spend this huge amount of time in an environment where you're expected to kind of dress and communicate and react to things in a specific way, I think can feel quite abstract and just a bit bizarre. So to try and build community and belonging, I think the way to do that as an individual almost is to do the opposite. So just demonstrate that actually we're all human, we've got work, but it's just one facet of your life. And if we kind of treat each other like human individuals rather than blocks in a hierarchy or, work robots or anything like that, and we let ourselves be authentic and encourage that in others, in all aspects, then I think the more comfortable work environments start to feel. And I think that extends to identity as well, and people will feel that they kind of belong anywhere they want to be. But yeah, for me, it's all about not kind of policing people's reactions and holding them to a standard that you wouldn't hold in any other area of your life. If you look at the kind of the bigger picture, it seems quite strange that we might expect people to not react authentically and just be themselves in somewhere that they spend, for most people, you know, a minimum of 8 hours a day.
Definitely, and I think there's a nice theme of kind of role modeling there across the three answers, right? Of kind of having the confidence to be authentic and talk about your own identity can then inspire that in other people. And I've definitely found in my experience that kind of opening up around my queer identity has helped other people talk about other aspects of their identity that they think are relevant that they otherwise might not talk about so much at work. That's really great. Thank you, all three of you. And let's move now with our last question to talk a bit about what businesses can do. And Farima, we'll come to you on this, if that's okay, with a question of what should businesses be doing to support the mental health of their young queer people?
Yes, thank you. And it's a great question. And I love some of the suggestions that we've heard. And I think a phrase that really stood out to me that was mentioned by a few of the panelists was that businesses have a responsibility to create a proactively inclusive environment. It is not on the community to fight every battle and correct everything. There should be work that businesses and workplaces need to do, because that, you know, it's the right thing to do, but also, you know, obviously it's the right thing to do, but it's also you're only going to get the best from your people if they're not expending loads of energy trying to be someone that they're not, or being nervous or anxious about, you know, what they say and when they say it to different people. So I think that's really important, and I think that can start right at the beginning. I think they should be thinking about it at recruitment stage. You know, they should be, you talked about role models. When you have, you know, a day in the life of an apprentice or a grad or whoever, you should have queer people in there who are open about, you know, who they are. Should there, you know, as Nicole was saying, should there be like a rainbow kind of trim around, you know, just make it very obvious. Talk about the inclusive activities you do. You know, what do you do? Do you have an LGBTQ plus network? That should be coming in recruitment, so people know where they are when they're applying for the job, and that should come through to induction as well. You know, networks should be known about from day dot. It shouldn't be something that you kind of stumble across 1 or 2 years in. It should be communicated in lots of different ways, and people should be made welcome. They should see senior leaders who are successful in their careers, who are queer, and we should see people at their level who are out. These role models should be, you know, I don't want to make people feel they have responsibility to be a role model and always be there, but if they maybe give a talk, not in a very explicit way, but they're just there, and so people know that they see people like them. And I think that's important, and it doesn't take, you know, too much energy to do that. The other thing is, when we were talking about mental health, you know, we know a number of organizations have mental health advocates, mental health persuaders. There should be people who have been from the queer community who are trained in that way. So if you do have struggles, if there is something, we've talked about at the beginning how because of lack of feeling of belonging you may be more likely to struggle, there should be people that you can go to who are like you, who will be more potentially may feel more comfortable to speak to. So that's something else that businesses could do. And there's just also the everyday, you know, we've talked a lot, a line manager is a really significant person in your life in a business, and it doesn't matter actually about role models if like you're fearing microaggressions from line managers. So do line managers have training? Have they been made to think, by the way, you know, you shouldn't automatically assume that in a large business that everyone that you are managing is straight? Have you, you know, it should occur to them to not make that assumption, so someone isn't put on the spot, as Nicole has said, that you're like, what do I say? You assume that my date's with a man. You know, there should be training there for them as well. So there's something about the everyday as well that should be done. But I think there's just so much that can be done. But and welcome more suggestions from this group. But businesses need to not be neutral. That's not good enough. They need to be proactively inclusive environments so people can be themselves.
Definitely agreed. Thank you, Farima. Did any of the rest of the panel want to come in on this? Oscar?
I was snapping my fingers at the last bit around not being neutral. So good, so important as well. And, you know, something that I deliver quite a lot of LGBTQ plus inclusion training through the different sort of jobs that I have. And something that strikes me quite often is that organizations will have things like the policies, they will have the networks, but there's still this culture of not necessarily understanding why LGBTQ plus people feel a bit negatively. I think this probably isn't the only solution, but one of the solutions that I'm realizing is that one thing that people really want is they want to feel like the organization they work for is in their corner. So when you look at the attitudes towards LGBTQ plus people, or when there's a negative media attack on a particular identity, things like that, your organization should feel like a safe place to be who you are. And I think, I'm not saying that there's an expectation to do this, but I think it goes a long way when organizations are willing to stand up and say, actually, we disagree with this. We really support our staff of this identity. And it doesn't necessarily just apply to LGBTQ plus people, but actually that sort of visible external approach, or even a partnership with an organization that specifics in those sort of areas of work, is something that can really create that sort of feeling of we're in your corner, we're here for you. And I think that's something that a lot of organizations are starting to do, and it does go a long way.
Definitely, yeah, I completely agree, Oscar. Nicole, Steph, did you want to come in on this?
I don't have anything to add, but I just I've noted down most of what Oscar said there because I thought it was fantastic. So thank you. I think you're right. I think the visible kind of external positions and kind of making those really clear, it does go a long way. It's that step. It's how you demonstrate not being neutral and being actively positive. So yeah, I completely agree. Thank you.
Definitely, thanks, Steph. So with that, maybe we'll wrap up the kind of more structured part of this panel event. I think there are two kind of really interesting themes that have come out of this for me. The first is being around reassurance to other young queer people. So we were speaking at the start about coming out, showing up to work authentically. I think the experience here is that generally it's not as bad as people might think. And more importantly, I think one takeaway for me was that positively role modeling that authenticity can then help other people. I think that can be really impactful. And then the other theme, I guess, is on kind of more business side, and what Farah has said has really resonated with me, of businesses can't be neutral around this. And we've seen some great examples today of where proactive support of the community has been really beneficial to our panelists. So that's been a really fascinating conversation, and thank you very much to the four of you for being so open with your experiences. We have a little bit of time now for Q&As, and I know that there's a couple of questions that have come through in the box, so we might try and pick up them just before we wrap up. So the first question we have from an anonymous attendee is that something they've struggled with since the start of their career is the indecision over whether to tick the box on job applications or surveys that ask about sexuality at work. The person asking the question is pansexual, and the first problem is that usually that box isn't even available to them, but then after that they couldn't choose whether it would be better to be honest and risk rejection, or being tokenized, or lie and not be themselves. And so the question really is, the person wondered what the panel thought of that and whether they've experienced that same indecision. Is there anyone who'd like to come in on that?
Yeah,
Nicole?
I can. Yeah, I have thought about this because I think I also in the beginning, kind of when I was applying for jobs or anything, I would think and think and think, which box should I click? Should I say, prefer not to say? I wasn't sure at that point, but the decision that I came to for myself, and this is just for me personally, is that I'm going to be myself and I'm going to select the box that represents me the most out of the options. And I'm just going to be that person because that is authentically me, and whatever happens from there is kind of not in my control, so I just said the part that I can control, I'm going to be me. So I don't know if this helps you in any way, but this was just my thought process and personally for me what I decided.
That's great, and that's a really reassuring message. Thanks, Nicole. Steph, Oscar, would you like to come in? Steph,
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah, so personally I've concluded along similar lines to Nicole, so I do the same. It's kind of it's a bit nerve-wracking not knowing where that data is going or what it's being used for, but given that you don't know, I tend to just default to honest. Now in my current role, I'm a equity, diversity and inclusion lead in the Bank of England, and I do look at a lot of the data that we collect on characteristics and just if it brings any comfort, all of the data that I see is anonymized. I wouldn't be able to identify an individual person, but we do use that to try and help inform the patterns that we lived experience within the bank. So the only uses I've ever seen that kind of data collection put to are really positive, and they're used to try and affect positive change. So I haven't seen that data collection used for purposes like, you know, tokenistic hiring, for example. Again, that's just my experience, but yeah, I would hope that that's kind of the purpose and the reason why those questions are asked.
Thanks, Steph. That's really reassuring. I think we've got time just to quickly cover off the other question in the box before we wrap up. So this person would be interested in hearing our perspectives on how people who are further on in their careers can best support queer or LGBTQ+ people who are at an earlier stage of their careers. And this question's come from a gay man. I think what they're kind of trying to tease out is what can older queer people do to help younger queer people. So any responses on that would be very interesting. Oscar.
I think a lot of what we've said still stands true. So sort of being that proactive and open role model of that identity is really important. I think also when you look at if your organization has a ERG or staff network or something along those lines, then actually being willing to step up into those sort of positions in terms of the committee of networks is also something that is really important. I think that a lot of people who are just starting out in their career maybe don't have that sort of capacity or confidence to step into those sort of roles. I know that some do, but I also know a lot probably would feel like they would like to get settled into a job first, really understand their role. And I feel like that is kind of the space where you could really create some impactful change as part of a network committee or aspects like that.
Definitely. Thanks, Oscar. And I think with that, we'll wrap up today's conversation. I hope those of you watching agree that this has been a really fascinating conversation. We're so lucky to have a panel who are so willing to share so openly about their experiences. So absolutely huge thanks to Oscar, Nicole, Steph and Farima for joining us today. Thanks also to Kate and to the CMHA team for helping us put this event together. I really hope it's been useful to those of you in the audience, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, Will.